All right, so we're recording here. So Dan, if you're ready, we'll get started. I'll start with a little introduction of our guest here. So this is Dan Van Dyke. He is the District Fish Biologist for the ODFW on the Rogue River, managing fish and fishing from the headwaters near Crater Lake down to the lower river near Agness. Dan's career includes work in 3 different fish districts, work in a wildlife district and the Wildlife Diversity Program, and a stint as the coordinator of both the Salmon Trout Enhancement Program, which is the STEP program, and the Fish Restoration and Enhancement Program. He's worked on the Rogue since 2004. Dan, take it away.
All right. If you could get that PowerPoint up.
Yep.
So appreciate everybody, I guess I'll say, tuning in to this current way of doing meetings, still current, I guess. For those of you that know ODFW and know our mission statement, to me, it's one of the most beautiful mission statements ever created. I have to be honest, protecting and enhancing Oregon's fish and wildlife for and their habitat for the benefit of present and future generations. Well, to me, that's what this plan is about. So I'm going to talk about the Rogue South Coast Multispecies Plan. It's a new plan for managing steelhead, coho, and cutthroat trout in Southwest Oregon. I'm going to focus on the Rogue, being the district biologist for this area. But truly, this, if I had to summarize it briefly, the RSP, it's protecting, enhancing these planned species of the Rogue and their habitat, again, present and future generations. It's that forward-thinking approach is part of what we do, is inculcated in what we do. Next slide. So I would encourage everyone who's interested to read the plan. It is long. I apologize for that, but actually that does reflect a whole lot of hard work that went into the plan. There's quite a bit of background on the Rogue, both at the beginning of the plan as well as in the first appendix. And some of that truly is all about talking about how unique the Rogue is compared to the rest of Western Oregon. I can almost do an entire talk on that alone. If you're a winter steelhead angler or an angler on the Nestucca, on the Wilson, on the Trask, the Rogue is different. We're much more ecologically tied to Northern California than to anything else on the west side of Oregon. We're naturally hotter and drier in the summer. We'll talk more about that here in a little bit. We have some unique species, or at least life history traits. We'll talk about half-pounder steelhead, the half-pounder life history. We're even socially different. In fact, the population in the Rogue is by far much larger than any other coastal watershed in Oregon. The next closest is the Umpqua watershed, and that's not even half of the human population present here in the Rogue. That, of course, presents challenges for fish production, but also opportunities. And really, I hope by the end of this talk, you'll see how productive this river is in the course of what we talk about. So the plan presents management strategies and actions to guide stewardship. And in the Rogue Valley, it's really all about water quality, and fish passage. Those are the primary factors limiting plant species. Next slide. So identifying the primary factors that limit these plant species, that was critical. That was key to this plan. And we do have an assessment of that in the RSP. It's critical both to focusing the plan, but also the plan's emphasis on focus for the collective effort at habitat protection and restoration by all partners working for fish and for producing more wild fish here in this watershed. Access, like I said, water quality and water quantity, those are primary limiting factors here in the Rogue, in the interior valley. And they're primary or secondary limiting factors for all populations covered in the RSP. In-stream structure and complexity, that was considered a primary or potential limiting factor for several populations in the plan. Non-native fish, we'll talk about that a bit more. Non-native fish predation and competition are considered secondary or potential limiting factors. And that's mostly related to the Rogue. So we have some minnows that are native to other watersheds in Oregon that were brought here illegally and are now basically ubiquitous. And I'm talking red side shiners and Umpqua pike minnow. Secondary or potential limiting factors, and we'll talk more about that, how that relates, how climate change relates to that as well. And then hatchery fish predation and competition was listed as a potential limiting factor in 3 population areas. Next slide. So I struggle for how to communicate this, but I'll just add that that whole concept of limiting factors and primary limiting factors, large numbers of fish can spawn in any particular year, but in the succeeding generation, you're only going to get back a return at levels that the habitat, and when I say habitat, that's river and ocean combined, what that habitat will produce. And that photo below is an example of not so good habitat here in the Rogue. So that's a summer steelhead stream. That's Lone Pine Creek on the airport here in Medford. For years, I've been with ODFW for 30 years now. And I always trash talked LA in my talks. I took a bunch of photos when I was down on a family trip to Southern California decades ago. And I'd like to show the concrete laden rivers and streams down there. Well, sure enough, we have some here in Medford. Very good for getting water off the land as quickly as possible. Not good for fish. Again, this is a summer steelhead stream, Lone Pine Creek. ODFW, one of our interns, documented a, I'm trying to remember what it was. I think it was like a 3 to 6 degree Fahrenheit increase from just above this reach on the airport and just below. So the water flowing in summer through that concrete is heating up and contributing hot water to Lone Pine and to Bear Creek, and definitely not helping cold water loving salmon and steelhead. Next slide. So the plan outlines several different management strategies as well as actions in each strategy. We're going to talk about some of these in particular. Ones I wasn't planning to get into a whole lot of detail on tonight, just trying to save time, are hatcheries, research and monitoring, outreach, enforcement, and facilities. Collectively, the objective, of course, job 1 is addressing the limiting factors, producing more wild fish by addressing the primary limiting factors in this watershed. The plan also provides a management framework generally for fishing and for hatchery programs. We've got actions about increasing engagement. And actually, I would consider that a little bit differently. We're going to talk about this. I see us actually challenging citizens. And I hope you might get involved to be part of the solution and get involved in restoration is fun. That's the fun side of fish management, but habitat protection is where help is needed. And again, we'll talk more about that. And then different actions on information sharing, information needs and such, also part of the plan. Next slide. Habitat is critical. And I mentioned focus earlier. I truly see the RSP as providing focus for the collective effort, like I said, of both habitat protection and restoration among ODFW and a whole bunch of partners, NGOs, groups like yourself, other agencies, just the gamut. We outline the framework clearly. So when it comes to restoration priorities, the restoration needs to be focused first on areas, primary limiting factors in areas with independent coho salmon populations. The coho is the only federally listed species under the ESA in the Rogue watershed or the South Coast. We're part of a different management unit. We're part of the Southern Oregon, Northern California aggregation managed by NOAA. But coho is our one ESA listed fish species here in the watershed. The second priority is to address primary limiting factors in other population areas. Population areas without coho salmon. And then finally, addressing secondary and even potential limiting factors in all population areas. Again, trying to provide focus to what is happening and what continues to be done here in the watershed. And we are going to be doing an additional prioritization to identify key watersheds as another layer of providing that focus and, in effect, trying to get the biggest bang for the buck with the restoration dollar. I've mentioned that this is about habitat protection and restoration. We'll talk about citizen involvement again, but we do include a beaver strategy as well. So actually, beavers are doing better than most people think in this watershed. There's a broad distribution, and for any of you that live in the Bear Creek subbasin, where more people live in the Bear Creek subbasin than in most coastal counties in Oregon, beaver dams or beavers and beaver dams are actually pretty widespread in an area where people don't necessarily want to live with their activities. We have beavers as a strategy. We want to especially help people learn to live with beavers. We identify some beaver emphasis areas in strategic areas of the watershed, and want to take advantage of that dam building nature of beavers, that intermittent dam building that can provide a whole lot of habitat benefits to fish and other species. Next slide.
So Dan, I'd just like to add on your beaver strategy, the newsletter that went out recently, you had mentioned some of that, but also, beavers wind up in some pretty neat places. We've actually had beavers documented within city limits of Central Point, so which is part of the Bear Creek drainage area, but there's some pretty small creeks that you could hop across, without too much difficulty.
Exactly right. I think there was even an Oregon field guide. Somebody may have seen it. I was told about it. There's a beaver dam on a small spring-fed stream right in Phoenix where the road splits, Highway 99 splits, and Phoenix has built a new civic center. Anyway, there's a beaver dam that beaver decided to colonize right there. And I think it was an episode of an Oregon field guide. That's what somebody told me. Kind of interesting. So water quantity is fairly obvious need for fish, or quantity, excuse me. I mentioned that the Rogue is naturally hotter and drier in summer than the rest of Western Oregon, and our fish have evolved and adapted, and summer steelhead are a case in point. They've evolved to be able to spawn successfully in streams that dry up naturally in summer. So they go up and spawn with the fall and winter rains. In the spring, as the fry hatch, the fry actually soon after hatching start to migrate downstream to move into a larger tributary, or often the Rogue itself, to spend the summer there. And then with fall rains, when the small streams get watered up again, they move back upstream. It's really nice, a specialized approach that they've taken to life history pattern. And again, allowing them to take advantage of streams that are often bone dry in the summertime. Water quality, of course, is important for cold water salmon and steelhead. It's kind of hard to have quality water when you see a stream with that photo in the middle there. That's Gore Creek in Medford, with all the riparian vegetation having been removed. We'll talk about projections of changing climate that's included in the plan here in just a bit. But I've got to tell you, it's just absolutely critical that we collectively promote and protect and restore riparian habitat, to keep streams as cool as possible for salmon and steelhead moving forward. And it's only going to become more critical with, again, projections for changing climate. Boy, in 30 to 50 years, we could be looking at becoming ecologically redding, and some projections farther south than that, if projections hold true. But there's an insidious tie between warm water and exotic species. There's a picture on the right of a red-side shiner in spawning coloration. So these exotic minnows that were brought here thrive in warmer water. Salmon and steelhead need cool water. In fact, there's a whole lot of research that says the shiners seen there can outcompete steelhead for the best habitat in small streams when the water's warm. When the water's on the cool side, favoring steelhead, the steelhead can then beat up the shiners and take the best habitat in streams. So not only is if we don't protect riparian habitat and keep shade and keep our water as cool and clean as possible, not only will that harm salmon and steelhead abundance moving forward, but it also favors these exotic fish species at the expense of our natives. Next.
So Dan, you brought up habitat and habitat protection. I'm just wondering if the biological opinion with the lawsuit between the National Marine Fishery Service and FEMA had any play in this, and if that's a question better saved to the end. I don't want to derail your presentation or discussion here, but that's actually going to move floodplain management in a different direction as far as what habitat considerations will need to be made. And so for those that aren't listening, the National Marine Fisheries Service sued FEMA over inadequate protections in floodplain management. So when people build houses along creeks and streams, they said that FEMA wasn't doing enough to address habitat degradation and protecting species such as the coho, which is endangered. So Dan, was that weighed in this at all, or I mean, they're all kind of similar topics, sort of circling the same things here.
Well, our personnel in our habitat division would be able to respond better than I can. I have a concern about what's happened in this whole response by FEMA. So I may have a different take than you do. My concern is what we're seeing as far as implementation through, I guess it'd be DLCD, is that habitat restoration projects that are all about just restoring what's been lost. Now we're having to go through permitting that is unbelievably difficult and a hurdle. So I don't know if this is answering or responding accurately to your question, but we have a big concern about the end result of that whole thing and what it means for permitting burdens on restoration.
Okay, that's kind of my opinion of it. Is the hurdles for permitting. I just don't know. I hope it's going to achieve the goals that they want to. I don't know if that's the case. But my question was more if that came into play in this discussion at all, as far as what this plan was trying to achieve. but it sounds like that was a separate conversation.
Yeah, I would say kind of a corollary or parallel path somewhat, but certainly floodplain management that's discussed here in the plan and discussed as a limiting factor.
Okay.
But in our case, it's water flow and quality water is kind of 1-2.
Okay. And I think you hit this a little bit. We do have a question that came in, and it asked if you could define actual temperatures for cool and warm relative to salmon and steelhead and warm water exotics like smallmouth bass and striped bass.
Well, again, what's interesting is we have smallmouth and largemouth, and I think we do get periodic striped bass showing up in the lower river. Nothing like the coos or coquille, but it is truly the pike minnow and the red-side shiners that are found everywhere. We think the rogue is a little bit different than the umpqua on the main stem because of gradient. We think that's the reason smallmouth bass have not been able to expand into a large self-sustaining population on the main stem rogue like they have on the umpqua. I have to admit, I'm worried whether that might change under climate projections if the rogue flows in the rogue decrease dramatically, but yeah, but to be sure, those exotic minnows are, I mean, they're all over Bear Creek, just as a for instance, right now, mostly shiners, less of extent umpqua pike minnow. But the magic number typically used for salmon and steelhead is like a 7-day average of 65 degrees. Pretty typically, mid to upper 50s is ideal for salmon, steelhead, and trout. 65, well, you're definitely getting on the warmer side. Now, keep in mind, we are naturally hotter than the rest of Western Oregon. So our fish have been exposed regularly to 70-degree ranges. And we've certainly seen mid 80s on the rogue, lower rogue in past drought years. But certainly once you start getting into the lower to upper 70s, water quality has turned to favoring these shiners, pike minnow, or some of the bass and warm water fish species.
All right.
So next slide. And please let me know if I'm going long. That's been happening quite a bit. So passage is extremely important. And again, it's related to our naturally more extreme climate. Just the ability for fish to move freely where they need to go, when they need to go to meet their needs. It's absolutely critical to population health and building resilience for the future. Can people see that little steelhead down at the froth below the barrier? This is a photo by river guide Scott Howell. And this is just the bike path culvert in Medford at Bear Creek Park, I think it is. Pretty crazy reason to have a fish barrier. It's been modified since this photo was taken, but when we have fall and winter rains, unlike this year, you can go to poorly placed culverts, places like this where there's a large jump, and during a freshet, you can watch little fish. I almost tried to do a video tonight. I can send a link to some videos that we have of juveniles trying to pass barriers, but you can just watch them. They're almost like popcorn, popping out of the water and trying to jump and make it past these barriers. I mean, it's easy to think of large dams affecting adult salmon and steelhead, but our little fish need to move around to be able to reach that smolt stage where they have the best chance to survive the trip to sea. They can't do that if they're wasting their energy fighting these barriers. And I need to tell you that you better believe blue heron, green heron, mink, other predators, they know that little salmon and steelhead get clogged up at these barriers. And that's, I think, a less understood source of predation. So passage is important. Next slide. So the plan includes the development of population benchmarks. In effect, we've got a scoreboard now in place for winter steelhead, summer steelhead, and coho salmon. So I apologize. Not the best looking slide, but what we have here for summer steelhead, the first number is the desired status level. So that's a 5-year average of 11,000 wild summer steelhead. The middle number is the current number. And then the number on the right is the level that would trigger conservation status and the need for additional action because of potential conservation concern. So for summer steelhead, this is based on the count of our late run summers that we get at the Huntley Park seining project every fall, or excuse me, every summer. So we're seining down there in the lower river. I think it's at River Mile 8, 3 days a week, all day long, and counting, among other fish, counting summer steelhead. We're also implementing some actions to learn more about early run summers that are the fish that move upstream into the upper Rogue before the Huntley Park count starts. So they're getting into the upper Rogue in late May, June, July. If anybody has questions about that, that was something we heard from our stakeholders in developing this plan, and we're making an effort to identify some ways we can track abundance of those early run summers. The winter steelhead numbers below, they're based on counts of wild half pounders. I'll talk more about half pounders, I think, in the next slide. But the count at Gold Ray Dam of wild winter steelhead was highly correlated to the count of wild half pounders that continues to this day at Huntley Park. So at this time, we've got a tracking system for the health of rogue winter steelhead based on that continuing count of wild half pounders. What this does is provide ODFW an early warning system. So we've got a conservation status level that can early on give us a heads up if conditions are changing and there's reason to take additional action to protect wild fish moving forward. Next slide.
Can you just clarify, so the middle column is the current status. So for the winter steelhead, the half pounders, you have two numbers there. Is that a current count? And then what's the 988 there?
Well, I just grabbed this from the plan, and to be honest, I didn't have time to
Okay.
double check that. I think one is a longer term average, but what I can do is verify that for you and send you an email on it. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that would be fine.
Okay.
Yep, thank you.
So I didn't know if this group was local or statewide, but it's just a fact that the Rogue is unique in having a half pounder steelhead as part of the life history of our fish. So many winter steelhead, about 30%, we estimate, and most summer steelhead in the range of 90 to 95%, make a half pounder run into fresh water after only 2 to 4 months at sea. So here in about another month to 2 months, we'll have the smolts heading downstream, heading to the ocean. A whole bunch of our wild steelhead only spent a couple of months at sea and then come back into the Rogue as 12, 14, 16 inch fish and just feed and spend time in the river, and then go back to sea the following spring. It's unique in Oregon, again, only found in the Rogue. It's also found in California, and actually it's quite rare throughout the range of steelhead in the North Pacific. Next slide. So we do include an assessment of climate and ocean change as part of the plan, and we have a fairly detailed set of updated projections for what that means for the Rogue. This graphic, I believe, is a graphic that's related to potential increases in stream temperature by 2080. And let's just say red is not good. So kind of the middle Rogue is an area where, and that's roughly downstream of Bear Creek, where some of the tribs, even the Applegate, are potentially looking at fairly large increases in what are already fairly warm summer temperatures that fish have to face. This climate change assessment has nothing to do with politics. All this is about is planning for the worst and hoping for the best. That to me is the approach, the best way to summarize this look and considering climate projections in how we manage. Next slide. We've actually accomplished something to increase resilience to climate projections already, and that's in our dam removal projects. And we're going to talk about dam removal at the very end. But Cole Rivers was the biologist here. He wasn't just a fish hatchery. He was a biologist here way back in the 40s and 50s and 60s. So according to Cole, the drought years of 1930 and 31 may have been the worst in recorded history. Very few tributaries not dry at the mouth by early summer. Fish loss reported everywhere in the basin. This one is what astounds me. He said the flow at Gold Ray dropped to about 600 cubic feet per second in the summer of 1931. I don't think there's anybody alive who has ever seen the Rogue River at 600 CFS at Gold Ray. I mean, it's low at 1400 CFS. So I can't imagine what that was like. Cole also wrote that the river temperature was increasing 1 degree every 6 miles. But this one, he said that it was found that at the reservoirs at Gold Ray, the river temperature increased 3.5 degrees and at Savage Rapids, 2.5 degrees. That's a pretty good increase in temperature in some fairly short distances. That heating is gone. So Gold Ray is gone, Savage Rapids is notched. So I got to say that this is a wonderful thing. We could be looking at very severe conditions this year. We saw severe conditions last year, but we're already avoiding 6 degrees of heating thanks to just a couple of dam removal projects that have been completed on the Rogue in recent years. Next slide. So we are in the plan purposely trying to challenge citizens to get involved. So here are just some of the examples that we put out there. One of the things we're trying to do is get information out about city and county riparian ordinances. So in Oregon, riparian habitat is protected through Oregon's land use law, and land use law is implemented by those cities and counties. Without citizens advocating for the protection of riparian habitat and implementation of those laws, it's not going to happen. It can't just be ODFW. The importance is too great, and too often ODFW is the only entity being that advocate. We want citizens to become involved in all aspects of water conservation. And that's advocating for a variety of protective actions and participating in land use reviews, expressing concerns about development actions and groundwater. And it's not about preventing development, it's about ensuring wise development, knowing what we're facing potentially in the next 30 to 50 years or this year. Citizens being involved in water right reviews. Again, this to me is critical. If somebody wants to talk more about it, please give me a call and I'd be happy to do it. Next slide. So moving on to fishing. So angling regulations here in the Rogue are actually pretty darn conservative, beginning in the 1990s. So we've got a sort of I guess I'll say a suite of angling regulations that were implemented and evolved between like 1991 and 97. So one of the big things we did was, and this doesn't always make landowners happy, but basically all tributaries of the Rogue are closed to all fishing. There are only a few exceptions in the special regulations. So unlike a lot of other watersheds, we've got a whole lot of water that is absolutely closed to fishing. We protect juvenile steelhead by the regulation that wild trout fishing, where allowed, it's closed to wild harvest. And this precludes wild harvest of half pounders as well. Juvenile steelhead are protected by the main stem closure to fishing during smolt out migration. So April 1 through May, now we say May 22nd, it's not legal to fish for trout in the Rogue River. And that's all about protecting those juvenile steelhead migrating to sea. Harvest is not allowed for adult summer steelhead. A lot of that has to do with the fact that because summer steelhead habitat is where a whole lot of people want to live, and a lot of the foothills between Medford, foothill streams between Medford and Grants Pass, that habitat is continually under threat. Any change from sensitive status is going to require a whole lot more, what am I looking for? Protection or better news for those primary summer steelhead streams as far as habitat goes. But we do offer a limited wild harvest opportunity on adult winter steelhead. Next slide. A lot of things are changing though, and we're going to be implementing this in time for 2023. So our plan is beginning in 2023, we have new fishing authorizations that are needed to fish for winter steelhead. So all anglers fishing for winter steelhead will need to get an authorization to fish winter steelhead in this area. And that's going to allow us for the first time to truly know how many people are fishing for winter steelhead. Then anyone who wants to take advantage of our limited opportunity to harvest wild winters, they have to purchase a separate, I'll call it a harvest card, but if you're doing it electronically, it would just be an electronic validation. So yeah, people who want that opportunity, and there's no requirement to harvest wild winters. People can release every wild winter steelhead they want. But starting next year, the plan is for folks that want to take advantage of that opportunity when it becomes available, they have to have this new card. And the money from those new authorizations will be dedicated to monitoring and research here in the Rogue and Southwest Oregon. We're also implementing new angling controls. We have harvest rate limits that are new. It varies based on the size of the watershed. For the Rogue, it'll be no greater than 15%. And you can see the graph on the right shows very little risk to the population at all with harvest rates until you get up to about the 40% level for harvest. And that's been mirrored in other watersheds as well. There's also the addition of that conservation status level we talked earlier. When the population is trending down, or on years where ocean survival knocks numbers down, now we've got that scoreboard in place to prompt additional action and restrictions on wild harvest opportunity. There's new monitoring involved. We're going to be re-implementing, for instance, spawning surveys for adult winter steelhead here in the middle and upper Rogue, primarily the upper Rogue. We've implemented other actions as well to estimate wild fish numbers. And there's going to be a 5-year review. We're going to be monitoring the data annually, but then collectively after 5 years, there will be a sit down just to verify that, in fact, we are staying below any levels of concern identified with this plan, and all our assumptions are holding true. Next slide.
Whoops, I went too fast there.
Well, this was the last one. I did want to add that we have a momentum for restoration that I don't think I can communicate it clearly enough. These photos you're seeing are Gold Ray Dam before and Gold Ray Dam just after removal. Since 2006, we've seen 30 dams removed from the Rogue watershed. Now, some of them are just small little things. Some of them are, I call them feral. There was a small dam on East Fork Jones Creek that Dan Delaney at the Stream Restoration Alliance was doing other work, and some landowner said, "Hey, why don't you take a look at this?" We're still finding remnant dams from the 19th century that are just out there, and all they're doing, they're not being used for anything. They're just blocking fish and reducing fish production. Regardless, there's a whole bunch of effort and a whole bunch of good work being done to restore passage and produce more wild fish in this watershed. In addition to the 30 dams that have been removed, I think there's been fish passage has been restored on many others. And I just lost my train of thought where I was going. But this all ties into, again, the ability for fish to move freely, where they need to go, when they need to go to complete their life cycle, spawning, rearing, etc. That's critical for health and climate change resilience. And with that, happy to answer any questions people might have, or people can contact me later.
Yeah, so Dan, I didn't see any other questions come in. If people have them, you can type them in the Q&A box, or even quickly here in the chat. So I just want to thank you, Dan, for your time and pushing this out. I know it's a lot of work. I think a lot of the concern was about steelhead in particular, but there's lots of, it's called the multi-species plan because it involves multiple species. And I liked your comment about public involvement. I think a lot of things can get done at the grassroots. People just need to get out, ask questions, with their public officials, and really just get involved is the big thing. So we did have one question come in here. So Joel is up in Beaverton, I believe. So he asks, is the Rogue having summer run issues like Northern Oregon?
Actually, the Rogue was a relative bright spot this last year for summer steelhead. So our numbers, gosh, I didn't write those down, but our numbers were actually pretty darn good this last year. They weren't quite at desired status, but I think we were at 7 to 9,000 wild late run summers. Shoot, I will add that to that email I'll send. But not only that, but the half pounder numbers. So the last time we were in a multi-year drought, and generally ocean conditions in the Pacific were generally poor. There was such a concern about wild summer steelhead and our half pounder run that the governor implemented a special task force to investigate options and ways to improve rogue summer steelhead and rogue half pounder run. Well, that was the early 90s. We're going through similar conditions now, and our summer steelhead are doing quite well and much better than they were in the 90s, to the point where I actually think our wild summer steelhead numbers are an early sign of fish response to this collective removal effort at dam removal. Fish response, unfortunately, takes generations to tease out environmental effects. And again, we've been going through multi-year drought. We've been going through oddball ocean conditions. It's just important to keep remembering it takes 25 years. So it's going to be now through like 2035 that I think we'll really see fish response coming from all this collective, like the older main stem dams that were removed. But no, our fish numbers, our summer steelhead numbers were pretty darn good.
All right. I didn't see any other questions here. So, I don't know, Dan, if you have some closing thoughts, some other things that folks could do if they're concerned, other than sort of getting involved, that public involvement. I'm sure ODFW has some projects that they could get involved in, pay attention to the website for those volunteer opportunities. But, if they have concerns, they want to get involved, they want to do something, do you have any sort of parting words of wisdom for them?
There are simply more needs than you would imagine. And again, it's from both a need for caution because of things that are happening, but also opportunities that are out there. If people are interested, there's a whole ODFW, we're just starting some outreach on the impacts of illegal activities associated with cannabis on fish. That has not really been communicated as well as it should have been. That's another layer when it comes to habitat issues. But if somebody wants to contact me, please do. But we'll be doing some outreach on that here in the next several weeks. But just the issues on Bear Creek and some of the management actions happening throughout the Bear Creek subbasin, huge opportunities for public involvement and public watchdogging, to be honest. And then there are just multiple entities out there involved in a variety of actions and restoration projects for anybody who wants to get involved in hands-on work on the ground. So it's our Salmon Trout Enhancement Program. I can connect you with Ryan Battleson, the different watershed councils, Rogue Riverkeeper, just a whole lot of ways folks can get involved in work to produce more fish. I'd encourage you to help out. And I think I actually see one of the participants may be somebody who volunteers with us quite regularly. I assume that's the Jim Ferguson that has volunteered with us. Jim, if it is the same Jim, he did terrific work helping us last year in work on Bear Creek when flows got very, very low, temperatures got very high, and it was a challenging year for salmon and steelhead in that urban stream. Thanks, Jim.
All right. Well, Dan, again, I appreciate your time. So for those of you that are still on, again, this is recorded. You can come back to it and go back through any of the information. So it feels like we've just been kind of scratching the surface on a lot of this stuff. So, a lot more information out there, lots of groups to get involved with, and certainly stay in touch with BHA. Now that we can kind of get out and about and have group activities again, certainly try to link up with Dan and other folks at ODFW to, get some boots on the ground and, I guess put our money where our mouth is and, work to keep the species that, that we enjoy fishing for. And, we're the backcountry hunters and anglers. So, we try to get involved as much as possible. But again, I thank everybody for attending. And Dan, your presence is requested for another night or possibly an in-person type of venue. So maybe we can schedule that at a later at a later time, your schedule permitting, and if you're willing. So but yeah, thanks again, guys. So again, watch, for this to pop up on our YouTube channel. Joel will be doing that for us. And Dan, again, I appreciate your time. So thank you.
Thanks. Bye.